The chandeliers at the marble room threw gold light across marble floors, polished like still water. The kind of room where nobody ever had to ask what something cost. Friday night, Newbury Street Back Bay, and every table in the dining room hummed, low and expensive. Elara Finch's hands were shaking. Not the nervous shake of someone new to carrying a wine bottle at shoulder height. 7 months into this job, she could carry 3 plates stacked without thinking twice. This was older. This was the kind of shake that started 20 minutes earlier in a back hallway that smelled like bleach and cut flowers, when Mira Lang had shoved a uniform into her hands 2 sizes too small and said it loud enough for the whole staff to hear, "Try it on," and if she couldn't fit into it, maybe she didn't belong here at all. Elara had held her breath to force the zipper up over her hips. The seam at her thigh trembled with the strain. Her ears went hot and red, the one place her body always betrayed her, and she'd said nothing at all, just straightened her collar and walked out with her spine set like a rod. That was 20 minutes ago. She was still walking like that now, a bottle of 2015 Barolo balanced on her tray, 26 years old and already an expert at looking like nothing had happened. The corner VIP table was the one every server quietly hoped to avoid. Elara set her tray level and crossed the marble floor toward it anyway. She felt him before she really saw him, the way the air around that table seemed to organize itself around one point. Black tailored suit, a raven tattoo curling up one side of his neck. Cade Moretti, the Mafia boss whose family had quietly run this city's oldest debts and darkest secrets for 3 generations. It took her a full second to make herself look away from him and toward the woman beside him instead, older silver hair pinned in a neat bun, her hands moving through the air in short, urgent gestures nobody at the table understood. Elara set the bottle down, and her own hands rose without asking her mind's permission, an old fluency passed down from a mother who had spoken only in silence her whole life, surfacing now the way muscle memory always does under enough pressure. The older woman's eyes went wide. She signed back in a long, relieved rush, then gripped Elara's hand and wouldn't let go. The entire VIP section went quiet. Mira stood frozen with her mouth open. Cade rose slowly, his eyes locked onto Elara like he was seeing an actual person for the first time in years. "How long have you worked here?" His voice was low even. 7 months, sir." The woman signed something else. He translated without looking away. "My mother says your hands move like someone who once had to be brave for someone else." Elara went pale. The sentence landed on a memory she'd spent 15 years trying to bury. What she didn't know yet was that Cade had just recognized something too. A single line from a 15-year-old police file he still kept locked in his private safe. A bystander's statement the night his family's driver was murdered on Longfellow Bridge. A young girl was seen signing to a woman as they fled the scene. One sentence carried for 15 years like a key with no matching door. He had just found the only living person who might finally open it. Before Elara turned to clear the next table, Cade was already typing 2 words to one of his men by the door. "Protect her, whatever it costs." 3 days later, an envelope arrived at Elara's apartment, $2,000 in cash and a note in careful handwriting. "My mother wants to see you outside of work, just once." She hadn't even decided how to answer it yet when the rest of that same week reminded her exactly what kind of room she still worked in. That same evening before her shift ended, a well-dressed regular waved her off loudly enough for the section to hear he'd prefer a different server, one who didn't take up quite so much space at his table. Mira stood beside him, smiling like she'd just been proven right. Elara only nodded once. "Of course, sir." Her hand curled into a fist at her side, knuckles going white, the only sign the words had landed anywhere at all. That night, walking home to her ground-floor apartment in South Boston, her phone lit up in her coat pocket. A photo. Longfellow Bridge midnight, the angle precise, the exact place her father had died in 2011. Below it, one line. Still remember that night. She was 11 years old that night. She remembered every second of it. She deleted the message, but her hands shook too badly to lock the screen. Elara didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with the phone face down beside her, as if not looking at it could undo what she'd already seen. Twice she reached for the envelope of cash still sitting unopened on the counter, and twice she pulled her hand back. She thought about her mother, a woman who had never once used a phone to call her, who had communicated in a language most of Boston had never bothered to learn. Rosa had taught her daughter to read a room in silence before she'd taught her to read a book. "Watch the hands first," she used to say back before there were no more hands left to watch. Words lie. Hands don't have time to. By morning, Elara had made a decision she couldn't fully explain, even to herself. Whoever was sending her photographs of that bridge already knew where she lived, what her real name meant, what she'd buried. Hiding from Cade Moretti wouldn't undo any of that. Answering the note the older woman had gone out of her way to send might, for the first time in 15 years, actually explain something. Elara arrived at Cade's penthouse overlooking the Charles River 2 days later. The elevator rose in near total silence, floor numbers ticking past too fast for a building this tall to feel real. And by the time the doors opened onto a private hallway, her pulse had climbed into her throat. Sophia opened the door herself and pulled her into an embrace before either woman said a single word. A tight, sure hold, the kind Elara hadn't been given by anyone since she was small enough to be picked up off the ground. Sophia smelled faintly of rosemary and old paper, like a house that had been lived in for decades by someone who never stopped cooking for people who weren't there anymore. They sat for hours in a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the river city lights beginning to blur gold against the glass as the afternoon slid into evening, signing back and forth in a rhythm that felt less like conversation and more like two instruments finally finding the same key. Sophia told her about a husband who had died slowly, worn down by grief and a quiet family war he never fully understood. She told her about a son who still wore a date tattooed into his forearm that he'd never explained to anyone. A son who had become a Mafia boss before he'd even finished grieving his own father. He got that the year everything changed. Sophia signed her hands, slowing on the word changed, the way a person's voice drops when they're circling something they don't quite want to name directly. He has never told me why that date, only that he needed to remember something he almost let himself forget. Elara's stomach turned over, without her understanding exactly why yet. She filed the detail away the same reflexive way she used to memorize an exit before sitting down in any room, instinct first, meaning later. Near midnight, Cade walked in, jacket already off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the low lamplight catching the tired set of his shoulders in a way the restaurant's chandeliers never had. He didn't ask what Elara was doing in his home at that hour. He only set a glass of water in front of her and said, "You're shaking. Who scared you?" When he rolled up his sleeve to reach for his phone, the numbers came into view. 1403-2011. Elara's eyes caught on the ink before she could stop them. Something in her chest went very still, the way a room goes still right before a glass tips off a table not yet broken, but already falling. She didn't know the date's meaning yet. She only knew in the wordless way her body had always known things before her mind caught up, that she'd seen it somewhere before. Her breath caught in her throat. The phone on the table lit up before she could speak. Silas Kane, Cade's cousin, calling with a voice pitched a little too cheerful, the kind of cheerful that arrives already knowing it's about to ruin someone's evening. It carried thin and tinny through the phone's speaker, loud enough that Sophia's eyes flicked toward the sound, even though she couldn't hear it, reading the change in her son's face instead. "Did you know your new waitress used to live in South Boston?" Cade's jaw tightened. Something crossed his face for less than a second, not surprise. Elara would realize much later, but the particular stillness of a man confirming a fear he'd already half expected. He wrapped his fingers gently around Elara's wrist, not to hold her there, just enough to stop her from running for the door. "If you run," he said quietly, "they'll find you before I do." Outside the window, a black car idled at the curb, its headlights switching off one by one, the sound of the engine settling into a low idle that seemed to match the pause in the room. What Elara couldn't have known was that Mira had already taken a call of her own 3 nights earlier, standing in the restaurant's back alley, long after closing the door, propped with a folded napkin so it wouldn't lock behind her. Her breath fogging in the cold as she dropped her voice low and agreed to a price for anything she overheard about the new girl. The man on the other end of the line hadn't needed to threaten her or flatter her much, just enough to make the offer feel like a favor rather than a betrayal. Being close to a Mafia boss's business, even at the edges, was worth more to Mira than any tip she'd ever been handed. Cade looked down at the street and said almost to himself, "The hunt has started." Neither of them said aloud what they were both starting to understand, that whatever connected the Moretti family to that bridge 15 years ago wasn't finished. It had only been waiting for her to come back. Mira sold out a woman she barely knew for a phone call and a payday. Would you call that survival, or something with no excuse at all? Drop your verdict in one word below. Elara didn't leave the penthouse until nearly 2 in the morning. Cade walked her down himself, past a doorman who nodded at him like a man greeting someone he was paid handsomely never to ask questions about, and out to the same black car that had idled outside his window. He didn't get in with her. He simply held the door, said nothing else about Silas or the bridge or the tattoo she still hadn't asked him about, and told the driver an address that wasn't her own. A longer route, he said, safer than her usual walk home. She watched the city slide past the window and thought for the first time in 15 years that someone else besides her was finally carrying part of the weight. The next afternoon sunlight cut low and gold across the study's bookshelves, dust catching in the light the way it only does in rooms that are cleaned often but rarely disturbed. Sophia pressed an old locket into Elara's palm, her fingers lingering over Elara's knuckles a beat longer than the gesture required. Inside wasn't a photograph, just a folded slip of paper with a string of numbers written in faded ink. The kind of ink that told you it had been written by a hand under pressure, in a hurry, a long time ago. "My mother kept this since the week your father died." Cade signed, translating his voice a half step lower than usual, as though the sentence cost him something to say out loud. "She never told me what it opened, only that it belonged to the person with your hands." What Sophia had never known, because Elara's mother never told her, was that the locket held more than a code. Rosa had given it to Sophia in the numb days after the shooting, terrified and grieving, asking only that she keep it safe. Sophia had kept her word for 15 years, without ever being sure what she was protecting. Elara turned the locket over once in her palm, the metal warm from Sophia's hand, and felt something in her chest tighten, the way it used to when her mother pressed something into her hands without explanation and simply expected her to trust it. Some things her mother used to sign you carry before you understand why. Understanding comes later, if it comes at all. Cade opened the safe behind his study's bookshelf, the mechanism clicking through its combination with a quiet, practiced efficiency that told Elara this wasn't the first secret this particular safe had ever held. Inside was an old pencil sketch. Its paper yellowed the face of the man who'd pulled the trigger on Longfellow Bridge. Elara knew it instantly. A younger version of Silas Kane. She stepped back, her voice hoarse. "I was 11. My father pushed me down before the second shot. I didn't finish drawing his face until I was 17. It took me that long to stop shaking every time I tried." Cade watched her say it, his own jaw working once tightly, the way a man's does when he's holding something back that isn't his place to say yet. He didn't reach for her. He only stayed close enough that she'd know without either of them saying it that she wasn't alone in the room with that memory anymore. One of Silas's men, summoned to verify the claim, sneered that a waitress couldn't have drawn something so precise she'd probably copied it from somewhere. His voice carried the particular contempt of a man used to talking over people he'd decided didn't matter, the same tone Mira had used with the too small uniform, the same tone the well-dressed regular had used at his table, a tone Elara had spent her whole adult life learning to stand very still inside of. Elara didn't argue. She turned the sketch over where her own signature and a date were still visible, and set it down without a word. "I drew this with these hands," she said, quiet but unwavering. "Hands that shook from fear, never from lying." Something shifted behind Cade's eyes as he watched her, not surprise at her composure, but recognition of it. The specific look of a man realizing he's found someone who has survived being underestimated her whole life and simply stopped flinching at it. A pawnshop receipt slipped loose from behind the sketch's backing, dated 8 days before the murder, listing a handgun serial number. Cade studied it and went still. That number traced back to a shell company his own family had once used to move weapons off the books. Silas hadn't bought the gun to hide from the Morettis, he'd bought it through them, confident no one would ever check. For a moment, Cade said nothing at all. He turned the receipt over, once, twice, the paper trembling almost imperceptibly between his fingers, the same tremor Elara had first noticed in her own hands the night she met him, though neither of them would ever point that out to the other. For 15 years, Cade had told himself he was hunting an outsider's crime, something that had happened to his family, not something his family had made possible. The serial number took that comfort away in a single second. A mafia boss can survive almost any enemy, but not the discovery that the rot he's spent his life avenging was growing in his own house the whole time. And that realization, more than any threat from Silas, is what finally makes Cade dangerous. "Bring Silas to the warehouse in Seaport," Cade said into his phone, his voice flat. But Mira had already made her call. Silas didn't go to any warehouse. He came to Elara's apartment first. The knock never came. Only the sound of the frame splintering sharp and sudden in the quiet of her ground-floor apartment. The kind of sound a body remembers longer than a mind does. Elara's heart slammed once, hard, before her training, 15 years of learning to move quietly to disappear into stillness, took over where panic tried to. The door was kicked in before she could reach the lock. She had just enough time to tuck the receipt into her sock before shadows filled the doorway, the streetlight behind them, throwing their outlines long and distorted across her kitchen floor. She pressed herself back against the counter, breath held so tightly her ribs ached, counting 1, 2, 3, the way she used to count under a car seat at 11 years old, waiting for a sound that meant it was safe to move again. Cade's men reached the building 4 minutes later, before a single shot was fired. Silas's men scattered rather than face a Moretti crew on Moretti ground boots pounding away down the fire escape and out into the alley, and by morning the only sign anything had happened was a splintered door frame and a receipt still hidden against Elara's ankle, the one piece of proof strong enough to end everything. Cade arrived himself not long after stepping through the broken doorway, without waiting to be let in, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He simply looked at her, checking her over the way a man checks a wound he's afraid to touch, before pulling her once briefly against him. Neither of them spoke about it afterward. It didn't need explaining. She sat on her kitchen floor afterward for a long time, the receipt still creased against her ankle, understanding for the first time that the thing she'd buried since childhood was about to come out into the light, whether she was ready or not. The 3 weeks between the break-in and the gala didn't pass quietly for anyone. Cade spent them building a case, brick by brick, keeping the pawnshop receipt in a safety deposit box under a name that wasn't his own, meeting twice with a federal contact he trusted more than most of his own blood, posting 2 men outside Elara's building every night without ever mentioning it to her directly. She noticed anyway. Same black car, parked at a slightly different angle each night, engine ticking as it cooled in the November air. She never asked him to stop. Elara spent them relearning how to sleep with the lights off. Some nights she sat at her kitchen table with a duplicate of the pawnshop receipt Cade had insisted she deserved to hold the truth in her own hands, not just borrow his account of it, and traced the serial number until the ink smudged under her thumb. She thought about her father's hands pushing her down onto the pavement, about a boy's shadow she hadn't understood was there at all. Sophia taught her 4 new phrases in sign language that week. I am not afraid. I know the truth. Watch closely. I am ready. She made Elara repeat the last one until her hands stopped shaking on it. 3 weeks later, a charity gala filled Boston Symphony Hall with warm amber light and a few hundred guests in evening wear. A string quartet worked through something slow and formal near the stage, the sound of it hanging in the air along with chandelier light refracted 100 times over in the champagne flutes carried past on silver trays. Elara stood near the service entrance in a borrowed black dress instead of a uniform 2 sizes too small, and for the first time in months, her collar didn't feel like something she had to defend. Cade insisted Elara come with him. He wanted her standing in the room when the truth finally surfaced, not hidden from it. Before they walked in, he slid a folded note into her palm. When my mother signs, say the account number out loud. My interpreter works for me. The room will hear all of it. His fingers stayed a second longer than the note required, and she felt the smallest tremor in them before he pulled his hand back, the first time she'd ever seen anything in him shake. For the first time, Elara understood the full shape of what he needed from her. Not just protection. A voice quiet enough and harmless enough to make the truth impossible to dismiss. You don't have to do this, he said low enough that only she could hear it under the quartet. Say the word and I'll find another way. She folded the note once and pressed it flat against her palm, the way she used to press her hand flat against a kitchen table as a girl waiting for her mother's fingers to spell out something safe. There isn't another way, she said. There's just a faster one and a slower one. I'd rather it be fast. He studied her for a moment, really studied her, the way he had that first night at the marble room, and nodded once, like he was filing the answer away somewhere. He intended to keep it. Carrying a tray past a cluster of guests near the stage, she heard a voice pitch sharp and cold enough to turn heads, a comment about how the venue must be desperate hiring servers built like that. Elara paused exactly 1 beat. She didn't blush this time, didn't flinch. She straightened the tray and kept walking at the same even pace. Before she'd gone 3 steps, the scrape of Sophia's chair against the marble floor cut through the quartet's last note louder than any voice in the room. Heads turned instinctively toward the sound before they understood what they were watching. An elegant, older woman in silver crossing an aisle at a black tie gala, just to take a waitress's hand in front of everyone. On stage, Silas Kane was midway through a speech about family and loyalty, his voice smooth and rehearsed, the kind he'd clearly given a version of before. Only his hands betrayed him. One kept drifting toward the breast pocket of his jacket and away again, like a man checking that something was still there. An aide at the edge of the stage held a leather folder of donation records, and every few sentences, Silas's eyes flicked toward it a half-second too long, the way a person checks that a door is still locked. Standing near the front tables, Elara let a line slip out just loud enough for the surrounding guests to catch how strange it was that an account ending in 7749 kept wiring money to Moscow on the same date every year, the anniversary of her father's death. Her voice didn't shake. She'd practiced that same evenness in Sophia's kitchen for 3 weeks, the way she used to practice holding her spine straight after Mira's insults, until steadiness became just another thing her body knew how to do without being told. The section around her went dead silent. A woman near the stage set her champagne flute down without drinking from it. Somewhere behind Elara, a man murmured a date under his breath, doing the math out loud before he caught himself. Sophia stood and began signing fast and certain. The interpreter translated in a voice that shook just enough to carry through the hall. Her nephew had betrayed Moretti blood. The gala's donations never reached the children it claimed to help. They'd reached the men who killed her husband's driver 15 years ago. Silas's composure broke. He pulled a gun from beneath his jacket. The quartet's bows stopped mid-note, one thin discordant screech hanging in the air before silence swallowed it whole. Cade was already standing behind him. Silas hadn't spent 15 years hating the Morettis out of simple greed. He'd spent them as the cousin who was always almost the heir, never quite chosen, watching Cade get the name, the loyalty, the mother who signed love into the air for him and no one else. Cruelty toward a waitress he'd never met came easily to a man who had spent his whole life feeling unseen himself. He simply never noticed he was doing to her exactly what had been done to him. "You kept the receipt from the North End," Cade said, low enough for a nearby microphone to catch it. "Want the rest of Boston to hear about that too?" Security closed in before Silas could raise the weapon past his waist. The gun was on the floor, and his hands were zip-tied behind his back within seconds. No shot fired, no one harmed, just a room full of witnesses watching a man's composure collapse under the weight of 15 years finally catching up to him. In the chaos that followed, police radios crackling near the stage doors, guests ushered out through the side halls, Sophia gripping Elara's hand tightly enough to leave marks, Elara caught sight of one familiar face near the coat check. Mira stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. The restaurant had let her go 2 days earlier, once whispers of the payoff reached the owner. She didn't try to speak to Elara. She only looked away, first, the way people do when they finally understand exactly how small they've made themselves. The 3 weeks that followed moved differently than the 15 years before them. Federal prosecutors took the pawn shop receipt and built the rest of the case around it. Weapons trafficking and wire fraud charges stacking up faster than Silas's lawyers could counter them. Cade testified exactly once, for 11 minutes, and said nothing about his own family's history with that shell company beyond what the receipt already proved. Elara wasn't called at all. Cade had made sure of that, quietly, in ways she suspected, but never asked him to explain. She went back to the marble room only once to collect her last paycheck. The new manager didn't ask her to try anything on. She didn't stay long enough to see if anyone recognized her. 3 weeks after that, Silas Kane was led out in handcuffs in front of cameras and reporters. The Moretti family said almost nothing. Cade gave the press one line. His family cleaned up its own mess. Elara stood on the penthouse terrace, overlooking the Charles, wind pulling at her hair and carrying up the faint sound of traffic crossing the bridges below Longfellow, among them lit gold against the dark water. Close enough now that she could pick it out without flinching. Cade stepped out behind her, hands in his pockets, the raven tattoo dark against his collar, under the city lights, its wings catching just enough glow from the room behind them that for a second it seemed like it might actually lift. "You could take a new name, take money, and leave Boston tonight," he said. "Or you could stay." She looked at him. "If I stay, do I still have to be a waitress?" He almost smiled, the first real one she'd seen from him, the hard lines around his mouth softening, the way stone softens under a slow, unlikely light before the stillness settled back over his face. "You do whatever you want. Just know that as long as you're breathing in this city, no one gets to look at you the way that room did again." He pulled a thin envelope from his jacket, a copy of her old records, every trace of the 2011 case, and her real address wiped from the city's systems 2 months earlier. "I did this before my mother even gave you the locket," he said quietly. Elara held the envelope in silence for a long moment. "If you erased everything," she finally asked, "what did you keep of me?" Cade didn't answer right away. He went inside, opened his own private safe, and came back with a second envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Inside was a photograph from that night in 2011, the shadow of an 18-year-old boy shoved hard beneath a car door an instant before a bullet found the wrong target. The man doing the pushing was Elara's father. The boy was Cade. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Somewhere below, a siren rose and faded on Storo Drive, and the sound of it seemed to reach backward 15 years, instead of forward. "I still remember the cold of the pavement," Cade said quietly, not quite looking at her, as if the words were easier to say to the river than to her face. "Colder than I expected. I remember your father's hand on the back of my neck before I even understood what was happening, and I remember not understanding why a driver would risk his own life for a boy who wasn't even blood to him. I understood it about a year too late to ever thank him for it." "Your father was our driver," he went on, his voice rough for the first time since she'd met him. "Silas wanted me gone that night so he could take my place. Your father put his own body between me and that gun. I've spent 15 years protecting you without ever telling you why, because saying it out loud meant admitting I'm only standing here because your father isn't. Even the Mafia boss everyone in the city is afraid of couldn't say that sentence out loud until tonight." Elara's hand tightened around the photograph's edge until the old paper creased under her thumb. She thought of her father pushing her down onto the pavement in the same instant, in the same breath, saving two children 15 feet apart without either of them ever knowing about the other until now. "So this whole time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you owed him." Cade nodded once, his eyes red. "And now I owe you too." The wind off the river picked up, colder now. Elara held the photograph, and for the first time understood that every protective glance he'd ever given her had started in a moment 15 years earlier she had never known about at all. She didn't answer him with words. She only reached over and laced her fingers through his. The same hands that had once shaken over a wine bottle, now steady enough to hold something heavier. Neither of them let go for a long time. 6 months later, the penthouse kitchen smelled of saffron and butter, low afternoon light coming through tall windows and catching the steam rising off a pot on the stove. Sophia held Elara's hands, walking her through each step of a family risotto recipe entirely in sign language. Stir, now, wait. More wine, patience. The two women laughed with their eyes, needing no spoken word between them, and for a moment, Elara felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt since she was small, watching her own mother's hands move through the air at their kitchen table in South Boston. 2 women, 2 kitchens, 15 years apart, teaching her the same lesson without either of them knowing it. Some of the safest conversations she would ever have required no sound at all. Cade leaned in the doorway, pouring a drink, the ice clinking faintly against crystal as he set it down, watching the 2 people who mattered most to him in the world. He crossed the room. His arms came around her waist from behind, his palms settling at her hips, without hesitation. The same shape a crowded gala had once called something to be ashamed of. He leaned close, his voice low near her ear. "Last time you shook because you were afraid. This time, is it because of me?" She didn't answer with words. She only tilted her head, letting her cheek rest against the tattoo at his throat. On the counter, propped against a jar of saffron threads, sat a plain index card, in Elara's handwriting, 3 lines a little smudged from months of being carried around in a coat pocket. "I can hold a bottle steady while shaking inside. I taught myself to read fear in a stranger's hands. I loved someone enough to stay when it would have been safer to run." She'd stopped needing to read it every morning. Some mornings she just liked knowing it was there. Sophia looked at them and signed a short sentence. Cade translated softly. She says this house finally has room for someone real. Elara Finch didn't have to hide her hands anymore. She didn't have to hide her body, her past, or the 11-year-old girl who had once hidden under a car seat and memorized a stranger's face to survive. And for the first time, Cade Moretti understood that the debt he'd carried for 15 years had quietly become the place he wanted to stay for good.
Outside the window, the lights of Boston shimmered across the surface of the Charles River. Inside, for the first time in 15 years, Elara Finch no longer had to make herself smaller just to be allowed to exist. This story reminds us that the people who once made you feel small were never actually measuring your worth. They were only measuring their own comfort. If you've spent years shrinking yourself to keep the peace at a family table, in a marriage, or in a job that never once said thank you, here's something practical. Write down on one index card 3 things about yourself that no unkind voice ever gets to touch. A skill, a memory, a kindness you once did for someone. Keep that card in your wallet and read it on the mornings that feel hardest. Grief and quiet strength often live in the same house without canceling each other out. So if you're widowed, retired, or simply used to being the one who takes care of everyone else, give yourself permission this week to let someone take care of you instead, even for one afternoon. Call the neighbor who offered help and never got a call back. Say yes to the invitation you've been quietly turning down out of habit. Dignity was never about being loud. It was about staying exactly who you are while everyone else tries to convince you to be smaller. What did you think of Elara's transformation? Tell us in the comments below. If this story moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength, healing, and love that sees the whole person.